My name is Omar Tesdell, and I serve on the Institute on World Affairs, which is part of the Committee on Lectures, funded, of course, by the government of the student body. Before we get to tonight's speaker, I'd just like to mention two new additions to the lectures calendar. First is the day we get back from break, Monday, December 1st at 6 p.m. As part of our presidential candidate series, we have John Kerry at 6 p.m. on Monday the 1st in this room. And then John Edwards on December 3rd, which is a Wednesday, at 8 p.m. in this room as well. This evening, we have Sandra Olwan. As a Methodist pastor, Sandra Olwan works with Christmas Lutheran Church in Bethlehem at the International Center, an outreach ministry of that church. She has served through the General Board of Global Ministries as the United Methodists liaison to Jerusalem since December 1996, communicating concerns of the church to Jerusalem and Palestine, Israel, to the UMC worldwide. Through the UMC Visits program and the Joint Justice Education program, in partnership with Catholic Relief Services and the Presbyterian Church, she has accompanied hundreds of pilgrims and others on tours and engaged peoples of the three religions. She has written extensively on the current situation and published numerous articles in magazines and newspapers. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Sandra Olwan.
There's a short crowd. I feel like I'm going to be playing tennis here, watching going back and forth. But what I'd like to do this evening is give you a little bit, again, of sort of why I am there, living in Israel-Palestine, and what the extent of my work has been over these last 7 years. And then to give you an overview of where we are currently in the situation, primarily both trying to look at it from Israeli perspectives as well as Palestinian perspectives. And then lastly, look at where are some elements of hope. The question for the title of the talk was given is peace possible? And so I would like to at least try to somehow address that throughout the various sort of three segments of the talk as we go through tonight. So what is this United Methodist doing living in a place where we don't actually have any churches out of my own denomination? In the mid-1980s, the heads of the Christian communities in the Holy Land sent a letter out to many of the leaders of the church and the rest of the world. And in that letter they said, millions of your people come here every year on pilgrimage. They come and they run where Jesus walked. They rush from holy site to holy site. And they get back on their plane, and they've had a wonderful experience and have never figured out that there's actually people living in this land today. They don't know that there are Christians who live in this land. They don't know that the Christian community is primarily Palestinian, and they don't know that that means that we are a church living with the reality and under the reality of occupation. They also don't meet with Israelis or Palestinians, regardless of background or social perspective or political reality, so that when they leave, they don't have any sense about how they might participate with us in trying to be a part of searching for how we can create a just and durable and secure peace for the two peoples of the three traditions that call this place home. So a variety of the church communities took that plea really very seriously and began to set up various kinds of positions to have people on the ground in Jerusalem that would help facilitate those kinds of experiences. And so when I went in December of 1996, I went initially with the Middle East Council of Churches under the auspice of the United Methodist Church to begin this process of getting people off the tour bus, getting folks down on the streets and the alleyways, to go to visit Jewish settlements, to be in Palestinian refugee camps, to be in universities in both communities, to deal with human rights workers, peace movement folks, political leadership really and the religious leadership across a wide variety of spectrums and political outlooks and energies. And again, the idea of that was to try to help visitors who came to have an expansion of their exposure to the issues on the ground, to the people, to have some better understanding of their daily life and the kinds of issues that they faced in just trying to get up in the morning and to complete daily activities. And hopefully, through the people and the programs that they were visiting, that they would leave there inspired to come back to their home countries to figure out that they could be a part of this network of people who are seeking to truly build a just and durable peace in the region. And if you would, in sort of church language, to become peace with justice evangelists in their home places. It became more ecumenical in 1999 as we moved out of the Middle East Council of Churches to also work with Catholic Relief Service and the Presbyterian Church USA in this multilateral kind of sharing of this work to continue to encourage people to be off the tour bus. When the Intifada began, now most of you may know that the word Intifada is an Arabic word. It means rising up, more poetically is to shake off the chains that bind you. When that began in September of 29th of 2000, obviously almost immediately the tourism and the visitors dropped off dramatically. If you had come on one of our student trips or one of the church trips that we helped to run, and you had been with us in Bethlehem on the 25th of September of 2000, we would have waited 2 hours outside of the Church of the Nativity to get in because the number of crowds, people waiting to come and who were visiting. Literally a week later, if you had come, there would have been no one. Initially, that was because Bethlehem had been declared a closed military zone, so the visitors that were still coming because they couldn't cancel the trips couldn't get in, and then groups began to cancel, so that there was, to date, almost no regular visitors that are coming on any type of tourism or visits to the region. And so with that change, it meant how do we continue to communicate the situation on the ground when the primary method of doing that was through these visits and dialogue with people in both the Israeli and Palestinian communities. And so as Omar mentioned, I began to do a fair amount of writing through an email network, not only stories of my own that I was writing from the perspectives of what I was seeing on the streets around me across, whether in Jerusalem, in Tel Aviv, Haifa, in Gaza, in Bethlehem, Nablus, wherever in the area, but also beginning to send out articles that were written by Palestinians and Israelis that I felt would help give people an insight into the conflict and what was happening that would be different than maybe what they were getting in standard media and news coverage here, particularly in the United States. I tried to, particularly those pieces that were particularly good in analyzing a particular part of the ongoing conflict that I thought, again, would help stretch people's knowledge and understanding of the complexities so that, again, they would have some sense of how they might participate in the efforts to bring conclusion to the conflict. Let me end there with with just my work, and let's get into the crisis itself. Obviously, the last 3 years has meant a huge change in the life of everyone living in Israel-Palestine. Let me begin first by looking at some of the changes that have happened in the Israeli society, and then look at those in the Palestinian society. If you look at the Israeli society today, I think one of the overarching realities for many Israelis is a sense of deep insecurity and fear. Over the last 3 years, in particular in the last year and a half, with the increasing number of suicide bombings and attacks on Israelis, the increased level of insecurity and fear has really risen to be a very predominant factor in sort of the social life of many Israelis. People, of course, are very nervous and frightened from going to any sort of public space, whether it be restaurants, to shopping malls, to being on the beach, to riding on buses. Of course, one of the realities in Israel is that there are only public bus system, and so that parents who send their kids to school on buses, there's the soldiers and everyone else on those same buses, and so the sense of fear for parents as they send their children off to school every day as will someone happen to explode themselves on the bus that they are riding on. And so there's a great deal of trepidation for people because of the reality that they have lived with in these last, particularly again, the last year and a half. There has been, Israelis have buried just short of 950 people in the last 3 years. 25% of those who have been killed in the conflict to this time have been children. Okay. There was a very helpful poll, though, that came that has showed the level of this insecurity in Israeli society. Just before I went, it was published in a number of the Israeli papers. And it was a poll taken of Israelis living inside Israel, not those persons living in the settlements in the West Bank or in the Gaza Strip. So just those living within Israel in 1948. And there, 65% of the people polled in that particular poll said that they supported the abandonment of the settlements in the West Bank and Gaza as a means of reaching a final solution with the Palestinians. Now that's been a fairly consistent number in Israeli society. From anywhere from 50 to sort of 60, 65% has been a very common number for over 12 years in the polls inside the folks inside Israel itself, Israel 48. But in the same poll, 65% of the people said they also were supporting the Sharon government's manner of handling the current crisis, which seems at one level to be somewhat disconnected, because under the government currently has meant an expansion of settlements, an expansion of bypass roads, an expansion certainly of the security wall that is being built. The security wall, as the Israelis describe it, we'll talk about how the Palestinians describe it later. And so that it's meant in many ways a deepening of the occupation, and a deepening, broadening of the settlements. And so it seems to be very juxtaposed to saying we're willing to get rid of them, but yet at the same time support of a government that is continuing to expand them. But I think it was helpful for me as I realized I think the reality of how insecure Israelis feel right now on their city streets is really heightened, is really shown by that poll. There is a sense of where people are willing to go to end the conflict, to try to find a resolution, but also in the present moment demanding from their government a sense of security so that they're not fearful, and until they have that, not knowing how to get from here to there. If you look at the political structures in Israel right now, I think one of the other realities is that currently there is not an alternative political vision for the Israelis of how to get from where they are now to a different way of handling the conflict. There are two major parties in Israel, numerous other parties, but two major parties, the Likud and the Labor. And the Labor Party, which has always been sort of the primary opposition party to Likud, these two have gone back and forth throughout the years of Israeli history, is really in complete disarray at this point. There isn't any one person in the Labor Party that has sort of the ability or the energy to captivate people and to provide an alternative vision for how the Israeli government might deal with the current situation, and so that people are left with what they have currently now. People will ask me all the time, is there a political will to solve the conflict? And I think you have to say that under the current Israeli government structure, that there isn't a political will to solve the conflict because there's still a belief that they can win the conflict. And this was, I think, made fairly clear right after Prime Minister Sharon was elected in January of 2001, and again as he was re-elected last fall. One of the first things that appeared in the papers the day after were quotes in the Israeli press that they were translated into the English papers that said that his goal was to crush the Palestinians so that they would surrender, and that they would then accept the terms dictated to them, which is a fairly common way of looking at a conflict. You have a winner and a loser, and if you win, you get to dictate the terms to the loser of the conflict. And I think that that's still very much the reality. There was some hope by many when Prime Minister Sharon first mentioned the fact that he would be supportive of a Palestinian state, but as the details of that state that he's been willing to support so far has come out and been publicized, It has not looked much like a state, but more like Bantonization of the West Bank. So sort of separate colonies with a whole lot of restrictions on the Palestinians' control, with the Israelis continuing to control such things as water and borders and immigration in and out. So on the Israeli side, as I said, we're living very much with the sense of real fear of the insecurity in public spaces, the grief over the loss of the 950 people, with 25% of them being children, and a political sort of impasse in many ways. Now, there's been some new things happening in the last few days with just published this weekend were 4 former members or directors of Shin Bet, which is the sort of similar to the police, they're the head of sort of security police in Israel, who have come out in strong criticism of actually Sharon government's policy of handling the current crisis, and actually has said that they think that unless President Arafat is included in a peace agreement, that there'll be no way to end this, and that time is running out, and they need to really get back to serious work to find an end to the conflict. Let me look to the Palestinian side for just a moment. Palestinians are also living under a great deal of daily fear and insecurity. In fact, there's not an element of Palestinian life that hasn't been turned upside down in these last 3 years. Let me just try to step through some of the things that people have experienced and are experiencing today in the territories, so that you have a sense of what some of those things are. Almost immediately after the beginning of the Intifada, a number of things began to happen. One of them was the increased presence of manned checkpoints. These are checkpoints that are manned by either the border police or the Israeli military on roads inside the Palestinian territories, inside the West Bank, oftentimes between Palestinian cities and between Palestinian towns and villages. These were in addition to the ones that already existed between Palestinian territories and Israel proper itself. And a new phenomenon came with those, which were the presence of the unmanned roadblock. These roadblocks are built of either layers of dirt over large concrete blocks, sometimes debris, sometimes includes a trench dug through the road to prohibit any kind of movement through vehicles back and forth across various different roads. There's about 280 of these in the current reality across the West Bank in particular. And so that these roadblocks, in conjunction with the checkpoints, has completely disrupted any kind of movement from area to area. Let me give you an example. If you were to travel from Nablus to Ramallah, which would normally take you, well, if I drove you, it'd take you an hour and a half. If a Palestinian drove you, it'd get there an hour and 10 minutes. But I drive a lot slower. So, but today, to make that journey, can take you anywhere from 4 hours to 8 hours. And you can change your vehicle as many from 4 to 8 times. To have to get out of the car, climb over the roadblock, sometimes walk just to the other side of the roadblock and there'll be another shared taxi you can get into. Sometimes you have to walk 100 feet, sometimes a mile and a half to get to another roadblock and climb over and then get into another vehicle of some sort and continue on. Another example, if you were to come from the village in the north, Zababdeh, which is just at the very top of the West Bank, and you want again to come to Ramallah, it would take you again, under normal circumstances, about 2.25 hours, 2.5 hours to get there. Today it can take as many as 12 hours, and you can change your vehicle 22 times. So this means, of course, that no matter what you're doing, if you have to go for school, if you're going to work, if you're trying to get to the doctors, if you're trying to get to visit family, whether you're young, old, handicapped, carrying children, groceries, materials, you have to get out and do this moving and sort of climbing over the roadblocks to get from place to place. A few months into the Intifada also meant that the Israeli tanks were stationed on the outside of the various Palestinian cities. And that would begin a process, particularly between the sort of late October of 2000 up until late part of 2001, would mean that we'd oftentimes in many parts of the West Bank have nightly shelling of those tanks into cities, with also machine gun fire, and many times the Apache helicopters shooting missiles. Now, there was times, of course, that had been Palestinian men who were shooting either towards the soldiers or possibly towards settlements that would then initiate the Israelis responding with very heavy firepower. Other times the Israelis started first, and then some Palestinians would shoot back. So it was sort of ongoing. But at all times, the extent of the sort of firepower by the Israelis was astronomically large in comparison to what the Palestinians had in response. About a year into the Intifada, then, the tanks began to re-invade Palestinian cities, so that on the city streets and in different parts of the villages, again, we now had Israeli soldiers with tanks, armored personnel carriers, and jeeps being throughout the city and bringing that kind of disruption internally. Along with that, we came a new process called curfew. Now, in the United States, a lot of people hear curfew and they think, well, some towns put curfew on, say, at 10 o'clock at night. Say all youth under 18 have to go be inside and off the streets in time at 10 o'clock. But in this instance, it was 24-hour day curfew, day after day, sometimes month after month, for the entire population. So everyone was prohibited from leaving their homes in the areas where curfew was imposed. Now, I happen to live in Bethlehem, so just as an example, for the 7 months of 2002, the entire population of the Bethlehem area, over 170,000 people, were under 24-hour day curfew. Now, what that would mean is that as an example, we might have curfew would be imposed, and then maybe 4 days would go by, 5 days would go by, and there would be an announcement on the television screen saying, you are allowed to go out between 8 and noon. Well, you can imagine what happens when you have thousands of people who've been locked up in their homes for multiple days on end. There's pure chaos on the streets as people were rushing either to try to get to work if they could, to get food supplies, to visit family, to go to the doctors, and so on. It was a complete chaos in the sort of everyday life of people. After a while, when it went on so long, the schools even tried to open during those periods so that the children could come at least and try to get assignments that they might be able to try to work on while they were unable to be in school. The curfews went on across the West Bank, and the largest period of time of the curfew was April and May of 2000, which was the time period called Operation Defensive Shield by the Israeli military. And at that point, Relief Aid, which is a relief agency that monitors humanitarian concerns, documented that at one point, 1,100,000 Palestinians were under 24-hour day curfew. Now that number went up and down from between about 400,000 up to this million, off and on all of 2002. Now luckily during 2003, the curfews have greatly reduced in number and in presence. So that's one thing that has gotten slightly better for families, as we don't have as many days of curfew going on as we had in the year and a half prior to that. I think one of the other sort of major thing for Palestinians, of course, that has gone on, which is this new security wall. The Israelis are calling it a security wall because, again, it's saying that we have to stop Palestinian bombers and from getting inside Israel itself, and that the only way to do that is for us to basically put a wall up so nobody can get in to our territory. Palestinians argue if you're going to build a fence, if that's the way you feel you have to go, then why aren't you building it on your land? Because at no place is the wall following the line of the Green Line, which is the armistice line between in 1948 between Israel and the West Bank. And in many cases, it's going very deep into Palestinian territory. Why? Because of the settlements. In a sense, because there are Israeli citizens who are living deep inside the West Bank, and so the wall is trying to snake around to include as many of the settlements as possible on the Israeli side of the fence, so to ease their access into Israel proper and their access to one another. But that has also meant then that there's a need to do internal fencing inside the West Bank because you have the bypass roads and the settlers moving back and forth. And so that many areas of the West Bank are literally being encaged by the wall. Let me give you one example. The town of Kikilia, which is in the sort of center northwest bank very close, basically on the Green Line, to Israel. This is a town, as I said, 42,000 people, and today it is circled 360 degrees by a wall and by a fence. There is one gate in and out of the city of Kikilia. It's a gate that is 8 meters wide and has a lock and key on it. And the Israeli soldiers have the lock and key, and at 6 o'clock in the morning, they open the door, and 6 o'clock at night, they close the door. On the days when they do. There's been many days when they either don't open it on time, and so in particular, not only does it affect the people inside the town, but obviously people, the villagers who rely on the town for school, for markets, to bring their goods, for doctors and so on, have to come and wait outside this gate. And so there's been, in fact, numerous stories in a number of U.S. papers over the last couple of weeks about children having to wait literally 2 hours both to get in and to get out of Kikilia at school. And there's been numerous days where the fence has not been opened at all. There's another area where 12,000 farmers are caught in between two segments of the wall and literally stuck in the midst of this, again, of the imprisonment. And of course, in many places also the wall is cutting farmers off from their land. So it goes right up against a village, and their farmland and their wells is on the other side of the fence. And so it's made, the complete sort of disruption and a further expropriation of land is what Palestinians sense is happening. The Israelis, of course, again say, well, it can always come down, that any wall can be dismantled. But the destruction that's happening with the numbers of trees that are being uprooted, homes that are being destroyed, and the footprint of the wall, as they call it, the businesses that are being bulldozed, it's a huge destruction, again, of economy and agriculture for the Palestinians. During this time, of course, throughout, we've also been seeing the regular still demolition of homes and the bulldozing of fields, olive and agricultural fields, citrus fruit and other kinds of trees. There's been about 400,000 olive and agricultural trees that have been uprooted and bulldozed under by the Israeli military in the last 3 years. Again, for the Israelis, it's just a security measure. Why? Because at some point, they say that a Palestinian has used either the tree or a house for cover and has shot at either soldiers or settlers or possibly sometimes inside Israel from the cover of these trees, and therefore to keep a clean field, they sweep it, so that, meaning that they bury under literally acres of trees for miles. You know, if you go down, particularly this has been very clear in the Gaza Strip, to see the literally acre after acre of complete fields that have been not only bulldozed over, but then buried underneath the dirt. Again, in Rafah 3 weeks ago, there was in a process of this clearing, it was 150 homes in about 2.5 days that were destroyed, leaving 2,000 Palestinian families homeless. Again, in the name, for the Israelis, of security. Palestinians see it as a way of both destroying their agriculture, which it's doing, and also trying to basically remove them from their houses, make them to be in smaller and smaller areas, so as a way of making sort of the enclave of Palestinians living in these little bantustans and prisons a much more of a reality. Let me talk about the political situation in the Palestinian Authority. We're a little less, a little less short of political chaos in the Palestinian Authority than we were a few weeks ago. As the Palestinian Legislative Council finally approved the new cabinet suggested by the new Prime Minister, Carrera. But the political leadership in the Palestinian Authority has very little, basically, a power over much of anything these days. The ministries that are still basically functional are the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Health, although both have been severely tested, again, because of these closures and curfews and these roadblocks cutting off people from everything. It's made the function of those ministries extremely difficult, but they are at least somehow functional. But in most of the rest of particularly the West Bank and certain key areas in the Gaza Strip, the Israeli military has control over everything, and so the political leadership doesn't have much control to do much of anything. As an example, the Palestinian Legislative Council has only been able to meet once in the last 3 years, because they have not been given permits by the Israelis to allow them to gather and to meet. Certainly, President Arafat, in this period of time, there's a great, I think, dilemma. Many Palestinians are very fed up with President Arafat. In fact, they're pretty fed up with most of the leadership in general. But there's also a sense that Arafat, as well as the others, are the elected leadership. They were elected by democratic elections in 1996 as a part of the Oslo period, and they're currently in a situation where no kind of elections are possible because of this lack of being able to move. There's no way in the current conditions that they live that any sense of elections and political transformation can happen in which the people participate. And so they resist any discussion by imposed coming from either Israel or the United States that say they will replace or remove President Arafat, even with as angry as they are at him oftentimes, because he was the elected president and he continues to be that president. But certainly the last 3 years have heightened some of the things he always has tendencies to, which has been to have very centralized control and to be sort of distrusting of other people in the leadership and wanting to keep everything under his own umbrella. And certainly those things have been heightened in the last 3 years, which has made some of the transformations that folks have tried to do in the Cabinet and Legislative Council more difficult, and has certainly added to the confusion and chaos in the situation. Palestinians have buried just short of 3,000 people. About 2,850, I think, was the number I saw last week. Also for them, 25% of those who have been killed have been children. So in a situation where you have much of the Israeli public who has this sense of fear and a political sense of the leadership at this point politically thinking they can win the conflict, and the Palestinians having their entire life turned upside down at every single aspect, and political leadership that has really no power to effect much change because of the situation, people are feeling extremely stuck and desperate. It's been particularly hard, I think, on the children, and particularly the children in the Palestinian territories who have lived under tremendous amount of assault over the last 3 years. From, in many places, consistent, and particularly nightly firing of machine guns and tanks and Apache helicopters firing, as well, of course, as the F-16 jets, which have been used off and on since June of 2001. If you go, I was in Gaza just a few weeks before I left to come here, and was talking with some 12-year-olds and who are in part of an educational program that we helped to fund. And one of the things the teachers were having difficulties with the 10 and 11 and 12-year-olds were trying to convince them to stay in school. Because one, parents wanted them to go out and try to work because everybody's looking for any kind of money because unemployment is so high across the Palestinian territories. But more, the children saying, well, I'm not going to be alive by the time I'm 16 or 17, so why should I go to school? Why should I learn anything? I'm not going to have a future. And that sense of despair across the society, and particularly among the children, is a very critical reality in the current cycle of the conflict. So in the midst of this, is there any view of hope, or is peace possible in this kind of a context? Well, of course, I'm a person of faith because I'm clergy and so on, but I would we have to say, of course, peace is possible. And if you say it's not possible, then we've destined the folks who live there, Israeli-Palestinian, regardless of their background and who they are, to just deeper and deeper cycles of this violence until it basically obliterates both people. And so that's not an acceptable answer. So of course peace is possible, but where is it? Who is it? If it's not right now in the upper political leadership, where are we going to find some elements of hope? Let me just lift up 3 stories for you, one from inside the Israeli community, one that's across the communities, and one within the Palestinian community, that I think are some examples of people who are helping to create a sense of hope and to keep hope alive so that people have a sense that maybe there is still a future ahead for them. In the Israeli community, As you may know, that in the Israeli community, the Jewish Israeli community, one of the mandatory things for young people, of course, is service in the Israeli Defense Forces. For young women, it's 2 years, and for young men, 3 years. And this is a very important part of the Israeli sort of ethos and identity, which really grew out of the traumas of Holocaust and World War II, in the sense that no matter what, we have to rely on others to defend us. We will defend ourselves now by ourselves and for ourselves. And so it's a very important part for many Jewish Israelis in sort of the ethos and understanding of Israeli society. And it often impacts which jobs people get and so on, depending on which unit they served in. So it's very integrated into the identity. But about a year and a half into the Intifada, initially a little under 400, and to date now over 800 Israeli reservists signed a letter and published this across the papers inside Israel, saying that they were proud members of the IDF. They were proud to serve as a reserve soldier in their army. But they felt that to continue to serve as reserve duty, if it was going to be in the occupied territories, was not only not serving their country, but was actually leading it towards greater chaos. In their letter, they said they felt that the occupation of the Palestinian territories was actually the root of the violence, regardless of whether it was Palestinian or Israeli initiated at this point. And that they were happy to serve the reserve duty anywhere inside the country, but not in the territories. And this was at a period of time, of course, when Israelis are being killed. And so to take that stance was really, I think, a sign, for them of sort of trying to make a moral choice. And to date, many of those young men, and primarily they were young men, have served prison duty now for that conviction and for that belief. They were joined just recently in the early part of September. 27 Israeli Air Force pilots signed a similar letter saying that they would refuse to fly missions over the Palestinian territories because there was no way they could drop bombs on any specific target and not also cause great damage and or death or destruction to Palestinians who were not engaged in any form of armed resistance towards the Israelis, and it was increasing the harm done again to both peoples and feeding the cycles of violence. Now the soldiers caused a lot of a shockwave in Israeli society because of the identity, this whole identity issue, but greater shockwaves were contributed by this letter by the Air Force pilots. Air Force pilots, F-16 pilots, are not a dime a dozen. These are the elite of the military and are highly trained, and so it caused a huge shockwave. In fact, people who actually were supportive of the soldiers' right to make the statement were not supportive of the pilots. And so you continue even today to see sort of fallout from this and arguments going back whether or not soldiers have a right to make such determinations and to call under a time of attack and so on if this is being traitorous or not to their country. But I think that for me, as I look at these young people, some of them not so young, some of them are older and are actually officers and were officers in the army, not so that they were high up in the leadership. In a time when you have loss of life going on in your society and saying, but if we continue this, we're going to increase our death, is a remarkable stance. Another example from across the communities. As I said, Israelis have lost 950 people, Palestinians 2,850, roughly, on both sides. So there's a great deal of grief. There's a great deal of anger among the families and communities in many parts of Palestine and Israel. But there's a group of families that have formed a network called the Israeli-Palestinian Bereaved Families Network. And these are families who have lost their loved ones basically to the terror or the violence of each other, and have bonded together across the firing line to offer support and solace to each other. Two of the men who are very active, Yitzhak Frankenthal, who is an Israeli Jew, and Ghazi Brigitte, who is a Palestinian Muslim, have been very instrumental in actually coming and have been to the United States on speaking tours together a number of times. And they came last March, a year ago March, with 350 Israeli and Palestinian families to the United Nations. And they wrote before they came, Ghazi and Yitzhak wrote a common letter together. And in the letter they called it the argument of the coffins. And they said in the letter, we have every reason to be mortal enemies. One of us is an Israeli whose son was kidnapped 5 years ago by Hamas and assassinated, and one of us is a Palestinian whose brother was killed at a checkpoint inside the village. But out of our grief, we have united behind a common goal. And they went on to talk about that they were bringing these coffins, 1,000 coffins at that point, to place in front of the United Nations, which would be draped with Palestinian and Israeli flags as symbolizing all of the people who had been killed to date in the conflict. And they said that we were coming to the New York to demand of the Bush administration, the European Union, and the United Nations to stop the insane violence that has gripped both of our peoples, and to stop the violence that our leaders are unable or unwilling to prevent. They went on to say that many families who have lost sons and daughters in this blood feud are seeking revenge. They said, we are no less angry at those who have cost us our loved ones, but we are seeking peace and reconciliation. And they said, if we, the people who have paid the greatest price for the absence of peace, can find a way to overcome our differences and to work through issues and try to find a way forward, then our leaders have no excuse not to try. They said, we will make the argument of the coffins because all of the other arguments don't seem to work. People come up with reason after reason why this conflict can't be resolved, and we tell you that these coffins say to the arguments that they are not good reasons, they are bad excuses. And they challenge people to not forget those who have been lost, and on their behalf to work and to break the cycles of violence. Ghazi and Yitzhak crossed the chasms of hatred and grief and have been working together to try to find ways out of these cycles of violence. That's a remarkable thing that happened in the middle of a conflict. Why the conflict is still going on and both sides are still losing children, sons, daughters, and men, women, to reach across in the midst of conflict and try to be supportive of one another. Last story, and then we open it up for some questions. This comes from inside the Palestinian community. The International Center where I work, which is an extension ministry of the Lutheran Church in Bethlehem, is a center that's been designed to enhance and undergird the cultural identity and cultural expression of the Palestinian society. And in particular, look towards being a part of creating a pluralistic, dynamic, creative Palestinian society through enhancing this sense of cultural identity and expression. Seeing that through the cultural identity expression, people are given the tools to resist the dehumanizing aspects of the occupation and the violence around them, and also are given tools to do alternative ways of expressing themselves, to direct the anger or frustration they have, and to use culture as a means of being open to others, whether Israelis as well as the world at large. And so the Arts and Crafts Center is built on the main walkway in Bethlehem with the windows and shutters opening out onto the street. And if you walk down on any day, you might look in the windows and you'll see a Muslim woman wearing a hijab sitting next to a Christian man who's across from a refugee, next to someone from the university, who are working on mosaics and ceramics and stained glass and glass fusing and glass blowing and any kind of a variety of art forms expressing, from those who are formally educated to those with no formal education, from villagers. The whole of Palestinian society represented in these people as they work together in this center. And so as people go by, it becomes a normative thing to see and look and see all these varieties of society gathered together working. Well, we were tested severely because in the April-May incursion of 2002, the Arts and Crafts Center, as well as other parts of that facility, received almost $500,000 worth of damage due to tank shells, bullets, and just sheer vandalism by the Israeli soldiers when they came in during that period of time. They invaded the center 4 times during the first week of that incursion into Bethlehem. And so we're not sure whether we recover from that. But one of the miracles, I think, of the center was that as soon as the incursion was over, one of the first places that the artisans came to was back to the center to help begin shoveling out the debris, taking the shrapnel out of the walls, sweeping up the glass, trying to wire back on all the shutters that had been ripped off and at least put some coverage over the windows again, setting up the equipment that had been knocked over, picking up that which had been broken. And in the middle of that, as people were doing all this work, some of the artists in particular who were working with stained glass began to take the fragments of glass that we had swept up and sat down and began to create with those fragments of glass. And started to create stained glass angels out of the debris on the floor. And suddenly, you could feel sort of the whole place begin to transform itself, because in the midst of all the debris and the brokenness, started to hang all these beautiful angels that transmitted light. And for us, it was a real sense of what happens when people have a sense of ownership and feel a sense of part of a community, that they were able to not be defeated by the destruction, but actually take the broken pieces and create something new and beautiful out of it. Now, we used that story last year for our Christmas card in the center and from the church. And a few days after the Christmas card went out, we got a call from the Church of Norway saying, can we buy 500 of those angels? And then the Church of Sweden called, can we have 200? And so on. I think to date they've made almost 5,000 angels. Now we've used up all the glass from the building, and they're using, at this point, using the broken bottles that just come. There's no recycling, so we're using pop bottles and all kinds of bottles to make these angels. But the remarkable second miracle of the angels was that now a number of families, because of the angels, are self-sufficient. They're making enough money from the angels to pay their electric bill, to put food on their table, to keep their kids in school. And in a time when there is very little economic opportunity, particularly in the Bethlehem region, this ability to find a sense of hope for people has been a remarkable gift in the midst of destruction. If peace is peace possible, if places like Myanmar